Welcome to eDiscovery Leaders Live, where I get a chance to chat with luminaries in eDiscovery and related areas. This broadcast is sponsored by Reveal-Brainspace, the industry's leading AI eDiscovery platform. Don't forget to subscribe to watch me, George Socha, weekly with leaders in eDiscovery. Thank you for tuning in. Welcome to eDiscovery Leaders Live, hosted by ACEDS and sponsored by Reveal. I am George Socha. I head up brand awareness at Reveal. On each episode, I get the chance to chat with luminaries in eDiscovery and related areas. Past episodes of eDiscovery Leaders Live are available on the Reveal website. Go to revealdata.com, select resources, then select eDiscovery Leaders Live. Our guests this week are Stephanie Giammarco and Rick Ordemann, both with RSM. Stephanie is the consulting partner and North America leader, financial investigations and disputes consulting. How's that for a mouthful? Rick, an easier title, a director. Rick and Stephanie, welcome.
Thanks, George. It's great to be here with you.
Glad to have the two of you here. So I know we've got a full plate of stuff to cover. And before I ask you anything else, Stephanie, give your restrictions, the disclosures, whatever you want to call them.
Thank you, George. As George mentioned, Rick and I are both from RSM. Obviously, the views and the discussions here are simply those of ourselves and not from the organization. Thank you, George.
Thank you. So with that, I'd like you first, Stephanie, and then Rick, to briefly tell us how you ended up, what you do, and how it is you ended up doing that. So Stephanie, let's start with you.
Thanks, George. I'll make this short and sweet. About 20 plus years ago now, I was doing fraud investigations and realized that the data that is necessary to conduct those investigations, structured and unstructured, was really where the excitement was. And I got into eDiscovery at the very beginning when things were still being formed, the laws were still being written, the policies, the procedures, the tools were still being figured out, and have watched this industry really grow and develop into what it is today, which has been an absolute pleasure. Rick?
Yeah, for me, it was about 10 years ago. I completed a certificate at Georgetown University in advanced litigation support and project management. I got my first job offer and started a career then, and really focused on mostly analytics within the discovery and investigation space, but have spanned kind of the whole breadth of the EDRM.
And for what you do today, each of you, and let's start with you, Rick.
Yeah, so really end-to-end e-discovery and focus on investigations. Again, specialize really in the analytics space, and so trying to leverage the latest and greatest in machine learning technology to help drive efficiencies and really build the best product that we can.
And Stephanie?
And I work with Rick as part of our overarching fraud investigations, financial investigations work, as well as our litigation practice. All of those services that we provide require the capabilities that Rick and the team bring in terms of the e-discovery. So we're providing those holistic solutions and making sure that we use the e-discovery aspect of investigations as part of that solution.
Well, that description helps move us into the first topic. And let's start on that with you, Stephanie, on the differences between litigation and investigations when it comes to what you all are doing.
You know, George, I think that it really is specific to whether or not you're conducting a litigation versus an investigation in terms of what you do. Obviously, the tools primarily are the same, but I think that there is real value in understanding that big picture because you tailor what we do accordingly. You know, so first of all, you know, what is the purpose? Are you doing an investigation so you can uncover who knew what when? Or are you doing a litigation where you need to make sure that you have a wholesome approach that's defensible, that you can then make sure that you've provided everything to the other side, and really that defensibility component. And the second aspect, I think, of an investigation versus a litigation is your timing, right? It is imperative in investigation to find the most relevant information ASAP. And you need to know, as I mentioned, who knows what when, right? And so comprehensiveness will ultimately come. But the important thing is getting to the most important documents immediately because you don't have a lot of time. And not to suggest that you don't need those most important and highest priority documents in a litigation. It's just that you have more time to find them, if you will. I think also, you talk about the sequencing of what you do, right, which is very much tied to your timing of the investigation. And so you have to understand, what kind of a response plan are you putting together and what do you need to do in order to meet your obligations? Again, in an investigation, that's very different than it is in a litigation. Confidentiality is a very, very important component of the distinction between litigation and investigations, right? Oftentimes a litigation is public, so you filed a lawsuit, and so it's a very different discussion and a different conversation. When you're doing an investigation, it is a needs to know basis. Oftentimes, even within your organization, you need to keep your investigation quiet to make sure you get the information necessary in order to conduct that comprehensive investigation. So big bullet point in terms of confidentiality and weighing the difference between a litigation and an investigation. And I think lastly, what I would say is really the scope of what you're doing in that investigation. You have to keep in mind what your goal is, right? Who knew what when, and making sure you feel comfortable in that it got you to the right answer. When you're in a litigation, oftentimes that scope is really dependent on the information you receive from the other side, the requests that they've provided to you, and that will often drive what you do as compared to getting to the heart of the matter quickly. So those are just a couple of different items that we talk about when we compare the differences: the purpose, the timing, the sequencing, the confidentiality, and then of course your overall scope.
How do these differences then play out when you get involved in a lawsuit versus in an investigation?
Well, I think when you're working with counsel, whether it's in-house counsel or general counsel, that's when you start to develop your approach, right? And so understanding what do we need to do in planning, that gets to that sequencing part as well. It really impacts the overall approach to the investigation or litigation. I also think it's dependent on the type of individuals that you're going to work with, both within an e-discovery perspective and then outside of that, right? You need subject matter experts, and that can be, by the way, not just from an e-discovery analytics perspective, right? But, one of the things that I love working with Rick about is his deep industry expertise, right? So you bring an industry expertise to an investigation in a way that is different and more deep than you might in a litigation. Now, if you have to testify to the work that you're doing, well, then, of course, you need a different approach and a different expert as well in terms of making sure that you are appropriately prepared for the court side of things. So all of these things really impact how you want to approach and plan for the big picture investigation and litigation, and certainly from an e-discovery perspective.
So Rick, Stephanie brought up domain knowledge, which of course has to be combined with advanced skills to get effective things done. Why don't you focus on that for a bit here?
Yeah, sure. So I think really one of those key aspects is combining the domain knowledge along with the technical skills, as you mentioned. And the benefit there is having an understanding of the acronyms of what typical trade practices are involved. And when you start to look at different industries, people speak very differently. And in some industries, some actions are okay and some actions are not okay. You think like one of the broad examples is if you're working within the public sphere, there's a lot of regulations on what a public figure may or may not be able to do. But even within the private sector, there's ways in which companies work with each other and the way in which people work with each other that can be very different. So to draw from one very specific example, I'm a huge car guy. It is one of my hobbies from a very, very young age. Before I could even drive a car, it was a passion of mine. And I was been very fortunate that I've translated that into some of my domain knowledge for supporting the automotive community and automotive manufacturers and third-party manufacturers for automobile parts, and all of the investigations that come with being an automotive manufacturer and also a third-party supplier to overseas. And there are ways that people talk. There are specific knowledge about the way things operate within automobiles, if you're looking at product liability type issues. And having that little bit of expertise combined with the analytic skill set and the ability to move through the data as swiftly as possible and get that iterative feedback loop with counsel really helps create a more holistic kind of experience, as opposed to constantly having to go out to a different subject matter expert or somebody else who has that domain knowledge. And even in instances where we may not have it in, the first place, it's that opportunity to really educate yourself as quickly as you can on a new industry. And as a lifelong learner, I absolutely love that aspect about doing an investigation. I've gotten to dive into things like building airplane wings, to building trollers, to getting into oil and natural gas and refinement, and things that I otherwise would have no business trying to understand and deep dive into. But because they've been subject to some investigation I'm working on, I get to really grind out some of that education and find out all these different interests that I never knew I had.
So let's take that in two directions. First, in those situations where there's a new investigation and you do have that domain knowledge already, what does that look like, deploying that expertise from the get-go?
I think it really helps in finding those quick hitters. And as Stephanie had mentioned, you're trying to find the most influential documents as early as possible so that you can get that feedback loop with outside counsel and they can understand the direction that they want to go with the litigation or with the investigation. And so having that specific domain knowledge, I think, allows me personally to really focus in on some of those key aspects so that I know what's kind of the tradecraft that might be going on here when it comes to an inappropriate outside vendor relationship. Where are those emails where it's one-on-one communications only at off hours? Those are the things that you do not expect a sales representative to be having with a particular competitor. And so how do we analyze the communications analysis and focus in on why are these individuals speaking with other individuals who otherwise would be competitors? In the same sense, if you're internal, why is somebody from marketing speaking so much to somebody from legal who's speaking so much to somebody from engineering, let's say? And so having those kind of specific domain knowledge around how an automobile manufacturer might work and who is expected to be communicating with who can lead to those really early insights and say, hey, listen, this is an anomaly. Help me out here, outside counsel. Is this something that you would expect to see? Was there some special circumstance, or is this something that we need to dive deeper into?
So let's now take it down the other path, the lifetime learning path, if you will. It's another new investigation, but this one is an area where you don't have any particular domain knowledge or expertise.
Yeah, I think number one thing is to contact that network, right? Keeping those relationships up internally with your team members and seeing who might have that domain knowledge, who can you partner with? And in those instances where it's kind of rare, where it's completely new subject domain, I deep dive into all the internet research, all the expert reports, everything that I can get my hands on to really become as much of an expert as I can, as quickly as I can, so that at least I have a little bit of knowledge, just enough to be dangerous. Certainly don't hold myself out to be a true expert, but it always goes a long way. And then plus, Google's always your friend. So anytime you get those acronyms that you don't quite understand, and I like to think that I'm pretty good at solving acronyms, but there's been plenty of times that I've had to go online, and there's always a quick resource there to be able to find out exactly what the acronyms stand for and how things work, especially. Now you have diagrams, you have YouTube videos where somebody will break it down for you step by step on how something functions, and those have been really helpful resources.
George, I think,
go ahead.
Just working with Rick in that regard, I think there's, two other things that's worth noting. Oftentimes you have libraries of approaches from an investigation perspective, right? And so you can take those traditional fraud search terms and application of those types of analyses, and you can apply those as a foundation. the industry and domain expertise, like Rick just talked about, is that extra special way that you can really hone in on those documents quickly. Then also working with the client and making sure that we're in constant communication with them as these evolve in the areas that we're not as familiar with, right? When you own, hey, I've never been in the neurosurgical equipment, space. I've never done anything in there, right? So this is what we traditionally do. We have medical or life sciences type of investigation and expertise, and we could bring that to you, but help us make sure that we are considering that in light of some of that investigative work that Rick was just talking about, that proactive individual work. So it's a team effort, right? Especially in some of these niche areas.
So you get, of course, those matters where working with the client goes along swimmingly and everything, all the stars seem to align. Those other areas where you want to get that information out of clients, but for any of a number of reasons, they might not be so forthcoming. What do you do in that situation? Whichever one of you wants to take that first.
I'll start since I brought up the client communication, then I'll turn to Rick. I think at the end of the day, you're in it together and you're trying to accomplish a goal together. And hopefully that partnership, that communication, that we're in this to try and accomplish the goal together has been established. And so I think, most of the experience that we've had is that our clients want to help us do the best job that we can do, so we all are addressing and accomplishing the goals that were set forth. With that said, if there are things that we're just not getting to and it's a bit more challenging than we would normally hope, I think you have a couple of things. Rick mentioned, first of all, of course, your own research and your own network, right? So I have tons of friends in the discovery space. I think we all do, right? Even though it sometimes seems like an overwhelming industry, it's actually, it's not tremendous, it's not huge. And so calling on your network to say, hey, help me out. I've got this neuroscience case and I don't know much about neuroscience equipment. Can you help me? Right? Similarly, if someone's doing something in automotive and I got that call, I'd be like, hey, let me call Rick and of course we'll help you. Right. And so I think it's working in partnership with the clients, and then also making sure that, we need to bring our best to the client, and however we do that with them, and as well as, of course, keeping confidentiality, but, doing that as well. So I don't know, Rick, if you have some additional thoughts in that regard.
No, I think that's perfectly accurate. And also really just kind of that disarming initial conversations. Oftentimes, if you're working with somebody subject to litigation or an investigation, it could be at the highest order. I've had an opportunity to work on cases where at the end, a member of the C-suite was being walked out by security. And those are high intensity situations that nobody wants to be in. And so becoming really that trusted advisor early on, listening a little bit more and understanding that, yes, we're here to perform a job. Yes, we're going to move through something that may be uncomfortable, but at the end of the day, we're still two humans talking to each other. Allow me to listen a little bit more. Allow me to instill that confidence in you, the client, that we're going to make sure that everything we do is in your best interest, and establish a little bit of that personal relationship before you get right into the nitty gritty and the technical details.
So I'll take what you just said and use it as a somewhat awkward pivot. The notion of speaking truth to the client. Well, let's talk about speaking truth about AI, because AI, of course, is on the forefront of so many discussions today. And we have at least one very prominent example of a lawyer not using AI so appropriately. Rick, why don't you start with that one?
Yeah, and I think this is kind of a personal, I don't want to say vendetta that I have against some of the marketing around AI and the idea that it's this easy button and the computer will figure it out, and there's this black box behind the situation that cannot be explained or understood. And don't get me wrong, there are levels of machine learning that particularly social media companies and big data companies are using that go far, far deeper than some of the technologies that you commonly see in e-discovery and in investigations. But the more common tools do not operate in a black box. They can be explained. They are not easy buttons. They are important tools that need that human component to really be able to perform. And so I've always kind of changed the AI acronym to augmented intelligence to promote the idea that there are machines that do things far better than humans do, but there are plenty of things that humans continue to do far better than machines do. And so it's really that iterative loop between the machine and the human that's vitally important. And so I always try to, when I can, promote augmented intelligence versus artificial intelligence.
That is, isn't it the idea that human plus machine will beat human alone or machine alone any day of the week?
That's absolutely correct. Yep.
That's sometimes a hard concept still to get across. How do you deal with those situations where people are concerned or skittish about using AI of one sort or another?
I think it's really having those conversations and bringing it down to a very human level. And you can use all the analogies that are kind of typical out there. Did you look at the weather this morning? Well, that was using some form of predictive analytics. Did you watch a new TV show that you didn't know you were going to like because Netflix promoted it on your screen? We interact with predictive models that are driven by machine learning tens of times a day at a minimum, if not more. And so once you bring that familiarity to a more common level and say, these are things that you're already interacting with, and this is the approach that we're going to take. And taking that time to really be that trusted advisor, respond to questions. There's somebody on YouTube, I forget the name, but they like to break things down, explain it to me like I'm a first grader, a fifth grader, a high schooler, and a college expert. And so measuring the interaction that you're going to have. Is this somebody that is highly sophisticated in the technical skills and really wants to get into, the leveraging of machine learning for their investigation or for their litigation, and we can kind of move at a pretty quick pace? Or is this somebody that's entirely new and maybe needs to start with understanding how email threading works and how simple clustering works, or, near duplicate detection? And then maybe we can, crawl, walk, run our way into a more advanced machine learning type model situation.
One or both of you mentioned the black box problem, the notion that you're putting something in, the machine does magic, and you get results out of the end, but how can you trust any of that? And of course, you can't just say, well, it's not a black box. That's not sufficient.
Right.
How do you address that issue? Rick?
For me personally, it's kind of what I had mentioned before is measuring how deep we need to get into the technical details. And I'll bring it as far as the very, very fine point of what these individual words or tokenized words are being weighted as, how that model is showing the weights, and how that weighting has changed throughout the training of the model. I really deep dive into the technical details from clustering to machine learning, so that I have a furthered understanding, so that I can gauge how in-depth I need to be when I'm speaking with a client and how much they truly want to learn about the nitty-gritty. Sometimes it's, I understand, give me the baseline, is this defensible? How is it defensible? Throw a little bit of math in there and I'm comfortable. And in other times, I'll sit down and a couple hours, walk right through step by step every instance of, this is the decision that was made, this is why we made this decision, and these are the bits of metrics that are returned from the machine learning algorithm for us to be able to understand and how we're interpreting it. And we can do that in a number of different ways, through reports, through graphic visualizations, and many of the systems do it within themselves. But I've always found that taking that raw data and adding a little bit more polish on it and a little bit more explanation really helps when presenting it to a client. And then rather than just sending that report via email, maybe that's the initial delivery system, but then following up with a call and saying, what questions do you have? How can I explain this a little bit further?
I think I would add to that, George, also from an investigation perspective, right? Oftentimes, as we already talked about, the importance is getting to the most relevant information. So sometimes from an AI, augmented or artificial perspective, the most important thing is show and tell. So we recently did a very large investigation, and we used our search terms to start, and we found a bunch of relevant documents. Then we used Brainspace, and we identified a whole bunch of documents that had no keywords, but were very relevant to the investigation. Our client didn't really care how we got there. They needed the information that was most relevant to this investigation. So we have Rick on the technical side. He can explain it all. It's incredibly valuable to make sure you can. And so if anything ever comes of it in the future, you can explain that. But when you're also in an investigative situation where time is of the essence, these show and tells, if you will, are usually the best mechanism to ensure that people understand why this is valuable and how it's valuable with a human, right? You're not just putting it in that black box and having your ChatGPT problem, right? It's very logical in terms of how you're training that system and then what you're getting back.
And I think there's an important point, an additional important point in what you just said. It's not start one process, do that, and you're done. It's not necessarily start with one tool, use that once, and you're done. There's got to be a lot of iterative feedback going on here. Either of you have thoughts on that?
I mean, I couldn't agree more, and especially with an investigation, right? In a litigation, you often have a lot of the facts and information laid out for you. And in an investigation, it could be just a result of a whistleblower saying, hey, I think Susie in accounts payable is messing with expenses, right? And you don't have a lot to go on. And so now you start with that. You start with the people that might have the most relevant information. Then all of a sudden you uncover information in your analysis, structured and unstructured data, and it starts taking you on different paths, and you have to follow that path. And then you're getting information from an interview perspective. Well, the interviews are going to inform the analysis. So especially in an investigation, to go back to your first question, the difference between those investigations and litigation, not to suggest you don't iterate in a litigation approach, but you absolutely must be sure that you're not sticking to the plan for the sake of a plan in an investigation, that you're constantly updating that.
I think that's a really important point to consider when you're choosing who you partner with to perform this type of work and who you really go down that path with. Is it going to be somebody who is able to explain those things and to document and to pivot when there is a curveball that's thrown? We work with a lot of common data, and you think of emails and documents, but then you start to get into some of these more modern and latest and greatest ways of communication, and there's little nuances to it. And that can affect everything from processing to how it's reviewed to how it is leveraged in a machine learning model or a predictive model. And so making sure that you have a partner that understands those complications and is able to pivot when need to is really important. And then somebody that's going to defend that process should it be challenged later on in the life cycle. I think it's a key differentiator that you don't just have a how-to guide or a manual that you can go step by step. I did A and now I do B. Sometimes that there is a ZYX thrown in there, and you need to figure out what is the most appropriate next step, knowing that there might not be a purely correct answer, but there might be a best option answer.
So Stephanie, we've just got a couple minutes left. Why don't you close this out with a few takeaways for folks?
Sure. So I think what I would start off, as we've mentioned a couple of times here, is do not treat an investigation the same way you treat a litigation. So think about an approach, think about the goal of what you're trying to accomplish, and develop that plan accordingly. Keep that goal in mind. As you continue, you're certainly looking for a smoking gun in an investigation, but you're also looking for supporting evidence for and against the allegations that have been put forward. You need to be nimble and iterative, to your word, George, right, in your approach, especially when you're dealing with an investigation. You also want to make sure that you leverage industry expertise. Like Rick was talking about, it is very, very helpful to have that industry expertise in order to be as efficient and as effective as possible. And certainly in an investigation, as efficient and effective as possible, as soon as possible, right, is incredibly important. And lastly, I think that technology component, right, figuring out what you're trying to accomplish and what the benefits of these different AI-based tools, what you need to holistically accomplish your investigation or your litigation. So it's the approach, it's the goal, it's the industry, and it's the technology. I think those are the highlights of what we've talked about here today.
Well, Stephanie, Rick, thank you so much. Stephanie Giammarco is a consulting partner and the North American leader, Financial Investigations and Disputes Consulting. And Rick Ordemann is a director, both at RSM. I am George Socha. This has been eDiscovery Leaders Live, hosted by ACEDS and sponsored by Reveal. Rick, Stephanie, once again, thank you so much.
Thank you, George.
Thank you.